During closed-door testimony to the House Judiciary Committee today, former Manhattan U.S. Attorney Geoffrey Berman described how he left that office last month after being pressured to resign by Attorney General William Barr with the threat that he would be fired if he did not resign. In his written opening remarks to the committee that were publicly released, Geoffrey Berman said, "I told the Attorney General that there were important investigations in the office that I wanted to see through to completion." Joining us now is Congressman Eric Swalwell. He's a Democrat of California. He's a member of the Intelligence Committee and the House Judiciary Committee. He was in the room today. Congressman Swalwell, so it's not secret testimony. You can discuss it publicly. The cameras just weren't allowed in there today. Is that correct?
That was the request of Mr. Berman, but we will release the testimony very soon.
Okay, what do we need to know about this testimony?
Well, Lawrence, Mr. Berman's testimony proved once again that the Attorney General did not put America's interests first, didn't put your interests first, but the president's interests first, and that he went to Mr. Berman, repeatedly tried to pressure him, tried to bribe him, threatened him that if he did not move out of the way, he was going to be fired, his career would be damaged, and someone new would come in. And Lawrence, I think what's important for your viewers to understand, why does the president and his Attorney General care about this office? Well, no office is investigating the president more. They're looking at the president's friends, his lawyer, his campaign, his inaugural committee, and the president very clearly here through Attorney General Barr is trying to protect his friends and punish his enemies.
You just used the word tried to bribe him. The Chairman Nadler used that word, too, in a very carefully read statement that he had after the hearing today. Did you come away with it with the notion that it is possible that Attorney General Barr could at some point face criminal charges for what happened in this story?
That's not for me to decide. I hope that post-Trump independent prosecutors look at everything that the president and his corrupt team have done. But what is clear is that over and over, Mr. Berman was told that he could leave or he'd be given essentially a no-show job in the administration that would help build his book for contacts in the private sector. Mr. Berman thankfully held firm. And Lawrence, how do we know that there was ill intent by Attorney General Barr? Well, one, there's no innocent explanation for taking a prosecutor who had good reviews publicly and privately and putting in someone who is a golfing buddy of the president who's inexperienced. And, oh, by the way, Attorney General Barr lied about it in his public press release.
Let's listen to what Madeleine Dean, one of your colleagues, said about what she heard in the testimony today.
He warned us over and over again that the reason for his reluctance, the reason for his resistance, was to say that simply by putting in an outsider in that position, that extraordinarily important position, it would necessarily interrupt the important investigations. It would necessarily delay.
Did Geoffrey Berman explain how he managed to, in effect, win on the way out the door when he agreed to resign with the stipulation that his trusted deputy would take over the office instead of the person Donald Trump and William Barr wanted to put in there?
Yes, that office traditionally always has someone who has experience in that office, and he was able to make sure that Ms. Strauss was able to take over. And Lawrence, that's important because it looks like you can deduce here that the president and Barr are trying to either keep details of criminality coming out against the president before the election or to bury and make cases go away that would affect the president when he is an ex-president and can be prosecuted.
Talk about that point, because Donald Trump is individual one in the Michael Cohen case. That is a federal case that's in this U.S. Attorney's office. The Justice Department has an understanding with itself, in effect, that the president cannot be prosecuted for federal crimes while in office. That means, by implication, that on the afternoon of Inauguration Day, if Donald Trump is no longer president, that this office could turn individual one into a defendant just like Michael Cohen in the same case. Was it your sense that that is one of the possibilities ahead?
Mr. Berman did not say that explicitly. It was clear he wanted to protect the integrity of his investigations. We know that the president is criminally exposed, and the day after he is no longer president, he will no longer have a powerful attorney general to protect him.
What happens between now and then in the U.S. Attorney's Office? Does Geoffrey Berman have the sense that that office is still under threat?
He believes that its independence is protected right now with Ms. Strauss. Our job in Congress every day until this is the next president is to be an ankle monitor on the president and conduct the oversight to make sure that there is not further wrecking balls taken to the department or this office and its investigations.
And a quick last word, Congressman, on your reaction to the Supreme Court today, upholding Congress's right to issue subpoenas to the president for financial documents, but clarifying the standards Congress will have to use.
The rule of law has once again been reaffirmed. We will move on and conduct our oversight. And the president is a little less powerful today. And that's a good thing for the American people.